Hi, this is Rami, and I'm doing my presentation on the lived experience of unaccompanied minors. And this presentation is based in part on my dissertation, as well as some literature review I've done of other research studies. So to start off with a brief background and statistics, the Office of Refugee Resettlement or Unaccompanied Alien Children showed for the statistics for fiscal year 2018 that the majority of the children that were unaccompanied minors were over the age of 14, and of these statistics, 71% were boys. The majority of the countries of origin were El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and other countries, with Guatemala children taking up 54% of the statistics. In addition, there were about 170 facilities that ORR had in 23 different states, and the average stay of the children was from 57 days to 93 days. And there were 4,200 unaccompanied alien children per U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And then there were also children that either had a family or a parent that were in the United States. The countries that the children migrated from the three Central American countries, had the highest homicide rates in the world, with Honduras rating number 1, El Salvador rating number 4, and Guatemala rating number 5. In addition, the statistics showed that in these countries, there were 1 in 5 people that were victims of assault, just to give you an idea of the level of violence in those countries that unaccompanied migrants were coming from, unaccompanied minor children. There's been a rise in unaccompanied minors since 2014. However, more than 95% of them are coming from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. In 2014, there were also statistics that depicted that over 68,000 unaccompanied minors came to the United States, in addition to 68,000 children that came in family units. When looking at the migrant stats, you also see that there was a rise of migrants in the 1980s directly related to the civil wars in Central America. Another important piece of information is regarding Flores Settlement Agreement, which was created in 1997, which basically was set after a decade of mistreatment by INS of detained children. And it stated that children should be held in the least restrictive settings, and also set the national standards for treatment, detention, and the release of children. After 2001, there was also a change in agencies and departments and some realignment in structures and oversight. In 2008, the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act expanded HHS responsibilities and basically said that there was mandatory screening for trafficking victims before they were returned to their home, and they must be seen by an immigration judge, except for children that came from Mexico or Canada. And this law was created due to the recognition that children were increasingly at risk for child or sex trafficking. It also stated that children could not be detained for more than 72 hours and would need to be referred to ORR after 72 hours. In addition, each year thousands are held in Customs and Border Protection processing centers along the U.S. and southern borders. Another important fact is U.S. and Somalia are the only countries that did not ratify the Conventions of the Rights of a Child, which was created in 1989, which in essence says that children have much more rights in many other countries besides U.S. and Somalia. There was also a rise in unaccompanied El Salvadorian children in 2016, which was directly linked to the rise in violence. Most of this was due to violence from crime and gang violence. And that research showed that 1 in 4 people were victims of crime. And of the children that were interviewed, 40% stated they wanted to leave the country within a year. And children as young as 9 were being recruited for gangs. Trump has been changing the laws and removing protection of unaccompanied minors. And he's doing that also by reclassifying and redefining the term unaccompanied, which places significantly more children at risk. Some parallel patterns in Europe was that over 180,000 migrants crossed the Mediterranean, and during that trip, over 2,000 have died through those risky journeys. In 2014, half of the child migrants going to Italy were unaccompanied minors. And usually of the migrant population, 50% are children 18 and under, per my dissertation study. In 2015, 2/3 of the children that were going to Europe were unaccompanied minors. And then 54% of the asylum applications that were filed by unaccompanied minors in 2014 were the countries Syria, Afghanistan, Eritrea, or Somalia in descending order. Some of the ways that countries have tried to deny entry to unaccompanied minors is by falsely documenting their age as a way to deny their entry. In Australia, there's also mandatory detainment of those that come by boat, and they only take 2.2% of all asylums of the 44 industrialized countries. And one of the ways that Australia also manages the flow or stymies it is those that are arriving without proper documentation, which many people fleeing violence do not have adequate documentation. They detain them to islands where services are extremely difficult to receive, and there is much less public scrutiny of the conditions. In 2002, the Dutch government rejected 84% of asylum applicants, though 30% of these individuals were given humanitarian aid and permission to live in the country as long as their countries were considered unsafe. Unaccompanied minors are considered to be the most vulnerable groups out of all migrant groups for a variety of reasons. Over 55% of children that are in ORR facilities are in overcrowded facilities. For example, in facilities that house 200, there is over 18% that are in 100 to 199, over 16% with 50 to 99, and about 10% are overcrowded in under 50 facilities. The Flores Agreement also stipulates that children should not be in unlicensed facilities unless there's emergency or influx, and this should be in non-secure facilities, and more this is not being followed. In addition, they are required to have 1 individual counseling per week and 2 group sessions per week, and that is also not being met. In terms of discussion of the countries and conditions that unaccompanied minors are fleeing from, some of the countries have increased war, poverty, gangs, violence, and lack of state protection. Of unaccompanied minors that were interviewed, 77% of the children cited violence as the reason that they were leaving their country, and 58% expressed extreme fear that would qualify for international protection. There was also a rise in migration in 2016 due to the violence, despite policies to attempt to stymie the flows. As mentioned earlier, the three countries are Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Children in Scotland that were interviewed also cited reasons for leaving their country as instability, family persecution, war, and were often trafficked or were raped, endured sexual violence, or had oppression and aggression by their governments. The push factors that a Swedish study showed also showed that the majority of the children that migrated were first from African countries, and then the second highest were from Asian countries. A lot of the children also had higher rates of sexual abuse. With them, 67% of the girls were sexually abused and 14% of the boys. Many of them also witnessed extreme traumatic events, and 63% of unaccompanied minors experienced 4 or more events compared to those with parents, according to another one study. In addition, many of the studies also showed that there's increased violence against women and children. Many of the children that fled from Central America also, part of their pull factors were having family in the United States. So to describe some of the experiences during migration, in a study of those crossing through Mexico, it found that 52% were robbed while they were in transit, and 33% were victims of extortion, and there was increased crimes by criminal groups and Mexican officials. There's also increased vulnerability for children that were smuggled or brought by agents, and a lot of these children were raped, suffered sexual abuse by the agent, as well as sometimes their friends. In addition, these children also had a lot of confusion in terms of where they were. They had little information about where they were going, and they were increasingly trafficked or smuggled. And there's lack of preparation due to safety issues in their country of origin. There was a study of Afghan refugees that described their migration journeys, and they discussed taking journeys that were 6 months or longer. Their lives were often in danger. They had no passports or documents, and many had been independent from a young age. They lacked money, food, and water for long periods of time, and a lot of them lacked protection and also suffered from police brutality. And post-migration journeys, the detention statistics show that there's increased vulnerabilities for children whose parents are detained. There's also a lack of standards of care in detention facilities, and family detention centers in the U.S. showed that the majority were occupied with women and children under the age of 18. There's 3 family detention centers across the states. There were others that were open, mainly private corporations, but several were closed due to inadequate conditions. Before the children are detained, they were released into the community with family until after 2014. The governor was wanting to deter migration, and so the families were sent to detention centers as a way to deter migration. There's also a ruling in 2015 in California that showed that family detention centers were in violation of the Flores Agreement. There's several studies that show that there's increased mental health harm on children and adolescents due to detention. This was a study in Australia. In addition, many children do not successfully apply for asylum, even though they may meet criteria, because they may not have adequate legal representation. There's also educational impacts during all phases of the migration journey. Many of the children missed attending schools while they're migrating, and some may have missed it pre-migration as well as post-migration due to various barriers. There are several factors that influence well-being, adjustment, and resources for unaccompanied minors. First and foremost, the host country attitudes towards migrants impacts their well-being and their adjustments. So negative host country attitudes definitely impacts the adjustment process, in addition to instability of their living situation and long wait times for asylum. Lack of access to resources and language barriers are other causes for influencing well-being and adjustment. The factors that support resilience included having supportive relationships with foster families. Different countries also have different resources and systems, such as access to education, work, etc. A lack of information about the systems and how to access them also influences acculturation. Conflicts with, in a study with Sudanese unaccompanied minors, many had been separated from their families for decades in refugee camps prior to resettlement. So when they came here and they were placed with foster families, the majority of them had to change placement, over half of them. And there was a lot of conflict due to cultural disagreements, and the children had difficulty being treated as adolescents, especially as many of them had lacked having parents around and had a lack of parental authority, so this was also a challenge to their adjustment. There were also several studies that showed the important role of parents, teachers, and school counselors in educational success for at-risk unaccompanied minors. The experiences of unaccompanied African minors in Sweden showed that there was a complex asylum process that influenced adjustment, need for social support, educational guidance, and fitting in that served as resilience factors. In addition, in my dissertation, the role of pseudo-families in dormitories, particularly in Germany, made up for the anxiety and the separation from family members that unaccompanied minors were worried about that were back at home and that they lacked access to. In addition, in my dissertation, some of the things that influence well-being and adjustment is in places like Turkey and Germany, there were informal networks that were set up, particularly through social media, where people were able to access resources and get some informal mentorship. In Germany, neighborhoods basically, in essence, took on responsibility for helping refugees and migrants to adjust, and they had cultural exchange programs, and they also set up places where they can teach them languages and help them adjust to the environment. In addition, globally, there are a lot of deterrent policies in place to decrease the flow of migrants in several countries. U.S. policies are also aimed at deterring migration, as well as European countries and Australia. So recommendation strategies and resources, mentoring programs is one of the things that helps refugees and unaccompanied minors adjust, including having opportunities for social connections in communities, having access to resources and education about the availability. It's important to work with public defenders, judges, juvenile halls, and staff in a study with unaccompanied minors that were justice involved. Also having trauma-informed mental health services and education and training was also extremely important when working with unaccompanied minors. There should unaccompanied minors, for several reasons stated before, should also be spending a limited amount of time in custody due to the trauma that they've already undergone, along with possibility of increased risk of mental health symptoms. There should also be an evaluation of facilities and to make sure that they're following adequate policies and procedures when serving juvenile unaccompanied minors. And as mentioned earlier, there's also several resilience and protective factors for unaccompanied minors, including school, caregivers, counselors, teachers, and family. There should also be cultural training for all involved stakeholders that work with unaccompanied minors. And in addition, it's extremely important to involve unaccompanied minors' perspectives and their voice when thinking of recommendations, strategies, and resources to help them acculturate and adjust here and decrease some of the symptoms that they're experiencing. And to conclude, these are my references. Thank you.